Have you ever spent a lifetime building something you thought would always be yours, only to realize someone else had already decided what would happen to it? Imagine sitting at your own kitchen table, listening to your son and his wife make plans for your future as if you weren't even in the room. Not asking. Not hoping. Just assuming. That's exactly where this story begins, and what happened next changed an entire family forever. Today's emotional family story is about trust, expectations, inheritance, and the difficult choices that can quietly divide the people who love each other the most. If you enjoy realistic family drama stories with unexpected twists, make sure you stay until the very end, because every conversation, every promise, and every decision leads to a moment no one saw coming. For most of my life, my condo wasn't just a place to sleep. It was proof that every sacrifice had meant something. Every overtime shift, every holiday I spent working instead of traveling, every dollar I saved instead of spending, it all led to those four walls. It wasn't the biggest home on the block, and it certainly wasn't luxurious, but every inch of it carried memories. The living room held birthday celebrations. The balcony had watched countless sunsets after long workdays. The kitchen still echoed with laughter from family dinners that seemed impossible to replace. After my husband passed away several years earlier, the condo became even more meaningful. It wasn't simply property anymore. It became the place where I learned how to live again. Friends often suggested I sell it and move somewhere smaller, but I never felt ready. Home isn't measured by square footage. Sometimes it's measured by memories. My son, Daniel, understood that, or at least I believed he did. Growing up, he had always been thoughtful. He called every Sunday, remembered birthdays without reminders, and never left our visits without asking if I needed anything. When he married Emily, I welcomed her with an open heart. She was intelligent, confident, and ambitious. I genuinely wanted her to feel like part of the family. At first, everything seemed wonderful. They visited often. We'd share coffee on Saturday mornings, talk about work, laugh over old family stories, and dream about the future. Eventually, conversations turned toward buying their first home. Like many young couples, they worried about rising home prices, mortgage rates, and finding the perfect neighborhood. I listened with sympathy because I knew how difficult the housing market had become. One afternoon, while I was setting plates on the dining table, I overheard something that made me stop in the hallway. "We don't have to stress too much," Emily said quietly. Daniel answered with complete confidence. "Mom's condo will eventually be ours. We just need to be patient." For a second, I convinced myself I had misunderstood. Maybe he meant years from now. Maybe he was speaking carelessly. Maybe there was context I hadn't heard. I didn't want to believe my own son would talk about my home as though its future had already been decided. So I walked into the dining room smiling, pretending everything was normal. No one realized I'd heard a single word. Dinner continued with easy conversation, shared laughter, and stories about work. Yet every smile suddenly felt different. Every glance carried questions I couldn't ask. Every silence seemed louder than before. Over the following weeks, little comments started appearing where I'd never noticed them before. "This room would make a great nursery. The kitchen could really open up with a renovation. We'd probably paint these walls lighter." Each sentence was spoken casually, almost playfully. But together, they painted a picture that left me deeply unsettled. They weren't talking about possibilities anymore. They were discussing plans. Plans for my home. Plans for my future. Without ever asking what I wanted. I tried telling myself families sometimes speak carelessly. Maybe they were only dreaming out loud. Maybe I was being overly sensitive because grief has a way of making people protective of what they still have. Then one evening, everything became impossible to ignore. Daniel looked directly at Emily, smiled, and said, "Don't worry. I promised you will get Mom's condo someday." He didn't whisper. He didn't hesitate. He sounded certain. Emily smiled back with the confidence of someone who believed the promise had already been made. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I stayed silent. Instead of confronting them, I watched. Sometimes people reveal far more when they believe no one is paying attention. That night, after they left, I walked slowly through every room of the condo. My fingers traced the hallway walls. I paused beside family photographs that had been there for years. I stood on the balcony longer than usual, wondering whether I had somehow become invisible inside my own life. Was I just being emotional? Or had my son already decided that my home belonged to someone else? I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, while drinking coffee by the window, my phone rang. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Emily. It was a local realtor introducing herself with a cheerful voice. What she said next made my stomach drop. And before the week was over, a for sale sign would appear where I never imagined seeing one. I almost told the realtor she had the wrong number. My condo wasn't on the market, and I had never spoken to anyone about selling it. There had to be some kind of mistake. But before I could say much, she politely apologized and explained that someone had contacted her office asking about the property's value. She wasn't calling to list it yet. She simply wanted to know if I was interested in a free home valuation. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there staring at my coffee until it went cold. Her words kept replaying in my mind. Someone had asked about my condo. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a marketing call that happened to come at the worst possible time. Still, after everything I had overheard from Daniel and Emily, it didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention whenever they visited. I wasn't trying to spy on them. I simply wanted to understand what was really going on. Daniel seemed his usual cheerful self, asking if I needed groceries or help fixing a loose cabinet door. Emily complimented the flowers on my balcony and talked about work as if everything was perfectly normal. If there was a secret, neither of them showed it on their faces. Then small details began standing out in ways they never had before. Emily asked whether I had ever updated my will. She said it casually, explaining that she and Daniel had recently started organizing their own financial paperwork. It sounded like an ordinary conversation, but the timing made me uneasy. A few minutes later, Daniel mentioned how much condos in my neighborhood had increased in value over the past few years. He even joked that I had made a better investment than I probably realized. I smiled, but inside I was asking myself questions I never thought I would ask about my own family. Were these just harmless conversations, or were they quietly trying to figure out what would happen to my home? That evening, I opened an old file cabinet where I kept important papers. My mortgage had been paid off years ago. The deed was exactly where I had left it, along with old tax records and insurance documents. Looking through those papers reminded me of every step it had taken to build a secure future. Nothing about this condo had come easily. As I carefully returned the documents to the drawer, my phone buzzed with a new message from Daniel. Mom, Emily, and I were thinking we should stop by tomorrow. There's something important we'd like to discuss. I read the message twice. For some reason, I already had a feeling I wasn't going to like what I was about to hear. The next afternoon, I cleaned the kitchen even though it was already spotless. It gave my hands something to do while my mind raced through every possible conversation we might have. Maybe they wanted to share good news. Maybe they had found a house of their own. I kept trying to think positively, but the uneasy feeling from the realtor's phone call refused to disappear. When Daniel and Emily arrived, they brought coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. It was a thoughtful gesture, the kind they had made many times before. We chatted about work, the weather, and a family wedding coming up later that summer. For a while, it almost felt like any other visit. Then Daniel looked at Emily, and she gave him a small nod. There are a few things we've been thinking about, he began carefully. We wanted to get your opinion before making any big decisions. I appreciated that he said your opinion, but something about his tone made me wonder if their plans were already taking shape. Emily explained that they had been meeting with lenders, calculating budgets, and looking at homes every weekend. Prices kept climbing, and every property they liked seemed to disappear within days. They were frustrated, exhausted, and worried that homeownership was slipping further away. Listening to them, I genuinely understood their situation. Buying a home had never been easy, and the market was even tougher now. Part of me wanted to help however I could. But another part quietly remembered every comment about my condo, every assumption, every promise I had overheard. As the conversation continued, Daniel unfolded a sheet of paper from his folder. It looked like notes or figures he had carefully prepared. He slid it across the table but kept his hand resting on it for a moment, as if choosing his next words very carefully. I glanced down at the page. The first line mentioned my condo. Before I could read anything else, Daniel took a slow breath and said, "Mom, please hear us out before you decide how you feel." I looked from the paper to Daniel, then to Emily. Neither of them seemed angry or demanding. In fact, they both looked nervous, as if they had rehearsed this conversation more than once. That made the moment even harder. Whatever they were about to say mattered enough that they had planned every word. Daniel slowly moved the paper closer to me. It wasn't a contract or anything official. It was a page filled with numbers, estimated home prices, mortgage payments, and handwritten notes. Near the bottom was a simple sentence that immediately caught my attention: future plan for Mom's condo. My chest tightened. Daniel explained that they were trying to think long-term. They said they wanted stability, a place where they could eventually raise children, and a financial plan that would keep them from struggling for years. None of those dreams sounded unreasonable. Every parent wants their child to have a secure future. But then Emily quietly added, "We thought it would be better if we talked about everything now instead of waiting until someday." Her words were calm, yet they carried more weight than she probably realized. I asked them one simple question. "What exactly are you asking me?" For a few seconds, no one answered. The silence filled the room. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than before. Daniel finally admitted they had been discussing different possibilities for months. Renting my condo in the future, buying it from me if I ever wanted to move, or finding another arrangement that could help everyone. He insisted they didn't want to pressure me, but hearing that these conversations had been happening for months left me feeling like I had been left out of decisions involving my own home. Just then, the doorbell rang. None of us were expecting anyone. Daniel frowned. Emily looked just as confused. I walked to the front door, opened it slowly, and froze. Standing on my doorstep was the same realtor who had called me earlier that week, holding a folder in one hand and a for sale sign resting against her car. For a moment, none of us moved. I stood at the doorway, staring at the realtor, while she smiled politely, completely unaware of the silence inside my home. She glanced at the address on her clipboard, then back at me. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "I'm sorry if I'm a little early. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by." My heart was pounding. Behind me, I could feel Daniel and Emily looking toward the front door, trying to understand who had arrived. I stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind me before either of them could join the conversation. The realtor introduced herself again and held out the folder. "I prepared the market information you asked for," she said. "I also brought a sample listing plan, just in case you wanted to see what the process would look like." I blinked in confusion. "I never asked for this," I replied. She looked genuinely surprised. She checked her notes again, then frowned. "Oh, that's strange. Our office received an online request with your name, this address, and your phone number. I assumed it came directly from you." A cold feeling settled over me. Someone had submitted my information. Whether it was a misunderstanding, a simple mistake, or something else entirely, I had no idea. But hearing those words while Daniel and Emily sat inside discussing the future of my condo made the timing impossible to ignore. The realtor quickly apologized for the confusion. She explained that these things occasionally happened when people were researching property values or comparing housing options online. She assured me she would ask her office to double-check the inquiry and remove my information if it had been entered by accident. I thanked her for her professionalism, but before she walked back to her car, she said one more thing. There was one detail I almost forgot. The person who filled out the request mentioned they hoped to move quickly if the owner was interested. She smiled politely and wished me a good afternoon before driving away. I remained on the front steps long after her car disappeared. When I finally walked back inside, Daniel and Emily immediately looked at me with concerned expressions. Neither of them asked about the realtor. Instead, Daniel quietly slid the paper back across the table. "There's one more part of our plan," he said. "We weren't sure when to tell you, But after today, we think you deserve to know. Whatever was written on the next page had suddenly become far more important than the first. I sat down slowly, unsure whether I was ready to hear another word. The room felt unusually quiet. Daniel pushed the second page toward me, but this time he didn't rush me. He simply waited. I looked down and immediately noticed that it wasn't about transferring ownership of my condo. Instead, it listed 3 different options. The first suggested helping them search for a home within their own budget. The second involved them purchasing my condo one day only if I ever chose to sell it on my own terms. The third option was completely different. It read, "Mom stays exactly where she wants. We build our future without expecting her to give up her home." I looked up in surprise. Daniel took a deep breath. "Mom, I owe you an apology. A while ago, I told Emily that maybe one day we'd end up living here. I said it like it was almost certain. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to make promises about something that wasn't mine." Emily nodded. "I should have questioned that assumption instead of going along with it. We never wanted to make you feel like your home belonged to us. We just got caught up talking about the future." Hearing those words didn't erase the hurt, but it answered the question that had been weighing on me for days. They hadn't been trying to take my condo. They had been making plans without realizing how those plans sounded to the one person most affected. I told them about the realtor's visit and the online inquiry. Both of them looked genuinely confused. Daniel immediately pulled out his phone and searched through his emails. A few moments later, he frowned. "I think I know what happened." While comparing neighborhood property values online, he had filled out a home estimate form using my address so he could understand the local market. He believed it was an anonymous calculator and hadn't realized the information would be forwarded to a real estate office. He had completely forgotten about it until that moment. The mystery that had haunted me all week suddenly made sense. We all laughed with relief, though it was the kind of laughter that comes after several days of unnecessary worry. Then, just as the tension finally began to lift, my phone rang again. It was my longtime friend Linda. Without even saying hello, she excitedly said, "I just found the perfect condo for a young couple. I gave them your number because they said they were looking for advice." I looked at Daniel and Emily. They hadn't told anyone they were house hunting. So who was the young couple asking about homes, and why had they been sent to me instead? I put the call on speaker, and Linda repeated what she had just said. A young couple had reached out to her after hearing she knew the local housing market well. They were first-time buyers looking for practical advice, and during the conversation she mentioned that I had lived in the same condo for years and understood the neighborhood better than anyone she knew. She thought I might be willing to answer a few questions if they reached out. Daniel and Emily exchanged relieved smiles. "So it wasn't about us?" Daniel asked. Linda laughed. "Of course not. I didn't even know you two were looking for a house." The room felt lighter almost instantly. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. What had seemed like another secret turned out to be nothing more than an unexpected coincidence. Daniel leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "I guess we all let our imaginations get ahead of the facts." I smiled. "Maybe we did. But this week taught me something important. When families stop talking openly, even small misunderstandings can grow into something much bigger." Emily reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry we made assumptions about the future. This condo is your home, and it always will be for as long as you want it. We should have said that from the very beginning." I squeezed her hand. "Thank you." That's all I ever needed to hear. Over the next few months, things slowly returned to normal, but with one big difference. We talked more honestly. Instead of making plans for one another, we made plans with one another. When Daniel and Emily wanted advice about buying their first home, they asked. When I thought about my own future, I shared my thoughts instead of keeping them to myself. Eventually, they found a modest townhouse that fit their budget. It wasn't the biggest house on the market, but they were proud of earning it through patience, careful planning, and hard work. The day they received the keys, they invited me over before anyone else. We stood together in their empty living room, imagining the memories they would create there. As for my condo, I stayed exactly where I wanted to be. Every photo on the wall, every chair by the window, and every familiar corner reminded me that a home is more than an investment. It's a place filled with love, history, and the people who respect it. Looking back, I realized this story was never really about real estate, inheritance, or property values. It was about communication, trust, and remembering that family relationships are stronger when built on honesty instead of assumptions. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other isn't a house or a promise of one. It's the willingness to listen, to speak openly, and to make sure everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. If this emotional family story reminds us of anything, it's that misunderstandings can create distance, but honest conversations can bring people back together. And in the end, that became the most valuable thing any of us could ever call home.